Modern business operates on a scale that ignores borders. A single corporation can span dozens of countries, managing thousands of suppliers across oceans in seconds. But international human rights law was built for a different world. It was designed around a very specific assumption that individual governments enforce the rules within their own geographic territories. That creates an immediate problem when a massive multinational company sets up operations in a weak state or an active conflict zone. In these environments, the local host government lacks the capacity, or simply the will, to enforce basic human rights protections against corporate abuse. The host country can't act, and the company's home country claims it has no jurisdiction overseas. Because of this geographic mismatch, neither side steps up, leaving human rights abuses completely unchecked. This monolithic building is the United Nations headquarters in New York, and it's where the international community decided to directly address this legal vacuum by designing the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. Inside this room, the Human Rights Council officially endorsed guiding principles to turn that framework into a universal standard of conduct for global business. The innovation here isn't a new treaty. The framework does not create new international law. Instead, it takes the messy web of existing human rights obligations and organizes them into a clear, cohesive manual for both states and businesses. To close the accountability loophole, the UN divided the problem into two actionable overlapping pillars: the state duty to protect and corporate responsibility to respect. The first pillar requires states to actively protect against human rights abuses by third parties. Having laws on the books is no longer enough. Governments must actively prevent, investigate, and punish corporate violations. This diagram illustrates what the UN calls the state-business nexus. When a government owns a business enterprise or provides it with substantial support, like official investment insurance, that state has a heightened obligation to ensure the enterprise respects human rights. This dynamic is critical in conflict zones. In an armed conflict, the local host state's ability to maintain a regulatory shield shatters entirely, leaving citizens totally exposed. The framework expects the company's home state to step in. If a business refuses to cooperate in addressing severe human rights abuses abroad, the home state severs that pipeline, denying the company access to vital export credits and public services. Governments can no longer use the privatization of services or the excuse of foreign borders to ignore violations linked to their own financial support. The second pillar targets the companies themselves. The corporate responsibility to respect human rights exists completely independent of whether a host state is actually willing or able to enforce its own laws. This historic photograph shows Eleanor Roosevelt holding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN framework uses this document, along with the broader International Bill of Human Rights, as the absolute minimum benchmark for corporate behavior. It also incorporates the fundamental rights at work defined here by the International Labor Organization, ensuring that global labor standards are baked into the equation. To meet these standards, companies must execute human rights due diligence. Think of this diagram's radar sweep as an ongoing mandatory internal audit, where a company actively scans its operations to identify and mitigate adverse human rights impacts before they happen. But that sweep cannot stop at the factory doors. The framework explicitly extends this duty to a company's business relationships. A corporation must map its entire global supply chain, looking for risks among local partners and distant suppliers. The corporate pillar eliminates the defense of ignorance. A company is now strictly accountable for the human rights footprint of its entire value chain, regardless of how complex it gets. Under this framework, trading human rights as a voluntary PR exercise is no longer an option. It is an expected, auditable global benchmark for doing business. In practice, the two pillars interlock. We see states enforcing policies from the top down, locking together with corporations mapping and policing their supply chains from the bottom up. However, corporate human rights abuses still happen, but the framework successfully stripped away the jurisdictional gray areas that companies and states spent decades using to deflect blame. The framework built a rigorous new architecture for global commerce, ensuring the expectation to respect human rights permanently follows a corporation anywhere it operates.